Hello, everyone. Welcome to my pleasure dome. This is Balkwell's Books, and I am Balkwell, reporting to you live from the greatest city in the world. And today, we're going to talk about a book, because Balkwell's book is back. And I say this because I'm Balkwell, and I'm here with a book by Umberto Eco called The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana. Now, Umberto Eco, I've covered on this program before, many moons and years ago, but Umberto Eco, in his professional life, was a semiotician, meaning a man or woman, really a person, who studies signs and symbols. And by this, basically, we mean they study communication, or maybe sort of abstract forms of communication, or communication that is not entirely contained within what we would call words and spoken or written language. And many of Umberto Eco's novels, most of which he seemed to have written later on in his life, deal with lies and forgery, fiction and non-fiction, and the ways in which people construct these lies, they construct these forgeries, and how they become true, not only in the minds of listeners or people who have been persuaded by them, but in the case of a novel like Baudolino, which is somewhat more fantastical, these lies become manifest in reality, at least the reality of the novel, and how these lies, these forgeries, take on a truth of their own that is somewhat different than the general truth of the world or of reality. And you can see this theme sort of running through this novel as well. When you start a book by Umberto Eco, generally you go into it and you want to think, okay, who's this person narrating to me, or who's this about? And are they telling the truth? Or what are they trying to convince me of over the course of this novel? It's sort of just an inherent unreliability of the narrator just based on your experience with his works. So the premise of this novel, The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana, is as I will speak to you right now. The premise: there is a man, and he wakes up from a coma, or I guess some sort of coma, not quite a full-on coma, but he's in the hospital and he's been there for maybe hours or a day or something like this. And this man suffers from a very strange form of amnesia, wherein he remembers only things that he has read, but he doesn't remember anything about his own experiences. So any experience he's had in the world as himself is completely gone from his memory, but he remembers very well passages from books he's read. And the book starts off in the somewhat comical tone. The doctor asks the main character, well, what's your name? And he searches in his mind, and all he can think of is the first line of a novel. He says, my name is Arthur Gordon Pym, from, what's his name? Edgar Allan Poe's novel about Arthur Gordon Pym. And then the doctor says, no, it's not. That's, in fact, not your name. And the main character says, well, then call me Ishmael. So we have a bit of a, joke. So the book sort of starts in that way where you think, well, is this going to be just sort of a series of misadventures of a man who only remembers fictions? And maybe you could see Umberto Eco, probably the premise came to him as something of a joke, and he started writing it down, and then realized that you cannot fill a 400-page novel with jokes such as these. So the rest of the novel is concerned with, as you might expect, this man attempting to restore his memories of his own life, and not only the things he has looked at. This man is quite old, actually. Not quite old. He's in his 60s. I'm almost 30, so I can't say that's quite old anymore. This man is older than some people, twice as old as me. Um, and he has, a wife. He's got several kids. He's got friends. He's got like a business. He sells antique books, and he can't remember any of these people. Can't remember what his mother and father and look like, which it's quite a tragic sort of thing. And his wife and his family is trying to help him restore these memories, and nothing's quite working. And so what he decides to do is travel down to his sort of childhood home down in southern Italy, in a little village in southern Italy, and go through his old things that are stored in the attic there and see if he can piece together his life, one document at a time, until finally it all will come back to him. And so it's kind of ironic immediately that this man who only remembers things he has read, that's his problem. His means of rediscovering his memory is going back and reading a bunch of stuff. And it very soon becomes clear that this isn't really going to work, but he can't think of anything else to do. So he begins in sort of a haphazard fashion, but the first things he comes across are the literature of his childhood, the fiction and the comic books and things like this that he used to read. Things like Alexandre Dumas, The Three Musketeers, sort of adventure novels of this sort, many Italian books that people who didn't grow up in Italy in the early 20th century wouldn't really know about. Comic books, some of which are American and some of which are sort of some Italian or even Italian copies of American books for reasons that I'll get into very soon. But what he realizes reading these books are that the way literature affects us as children is maybe not different entirely from the way it affects us as adults, but the sort of emphasis is on different aspects. So what he remembers most from his childhood novels are phrases or images or sort of feelings that come from not a novel in its entirety, or not even a comic book in its entirety, but just from like a snapshot. There are panels in a comic that he remembers looking at over and over again for various reasons, either because there is an attractive woman in the panel, or because something is happening in this panel that just strikes him. And as a kid, you just reread over and over these same books, and you just latch on to these little moments within them. And you don't really care how the story, develops or progresses, or the arcs of the characters. You remember these moments. And actually, the title of the novel is a phrase or a title of one of these comic books, the Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana. And what the character realizes rereading this book as an adult is that it sucks, and that it doesn't make any sense, and that it not only does it suck, but it's generic, and it's haphazard, and it's just a bunch of tropes sort of thrown together willy-nilly in a somewhat cynical fashion. But he didn't care about this as a kid. He just thought the mysterious flame of Queen Loana was really interesting to think about. This mysterious flame, which in the book is a flame of immortality or something, like it bring people back from the dead or keep people alive forever, or some sort of thing like this. And just this sort of mystery, this weird queen out, I think in the jungle somewhere, just really captured him. And even with his amnesia and whatever, this is one of the phrases that comes back to his mind, and he has no idea where it's from. The mysterious flame of Queen Loana. What does that mean? It's so evocative of something, And working through his childhood, the books of his childhood, he sort of has several feelings like this, and he remembers these heroes and these people far more than he remembers anything about, the stories themselves. Later on, he sort of develops a new tactic. He realizes reading a bunch of books from his childhood isn't really getting him anywhere because he already remembers the books. That's his whole problem, is he only remembers books. So instead he starts going through things like newspapers and through his schoolwork, like the writings he would do for school and journals and such things as these. And here we get to a rather interesting aspect of the novel, and something that, a sort of motif that appears somewhat late, but becomes very, very important, and is somewhat autobiographical in nature. Umberto Eco talks a lot in lectures and things like this, and interviews, about his childhood. Growing up, he was born in the early 30s, and so he grew up under the fascist government of Mussolini in Italy. And then, obviously, they went into World War II. And so the sort of origin point of his interest in falsification is from propaganda. During this time, he received a fascist education in which he was told all of these things about the world that didn't turn out to be true, and was told to revere these people and these figures and these ideals that whose basis in reality is somewhat suspect. And when he's looking through his schoolwork, he can see things he wrote as a child, sort of praising Il Duce and praising the Italian soldiers and their conquest of Abyssinia, also known as Ethiopia, and things like this. And then a few years later, he's able to look at his school books, maybe a few grades higher, and he's developed a more critical tone. And he starts to wonder, well, where did this come from? How did I, at maybe 9 or 10 years old, write all these things? Maybe 8, I don't know the exact, but for example, at 8 or 9 years old, write all these things praising Mussolini, and then a few years later, suddenly, I think they're a bunch of jerks. And he's trying to discover what happened to him, what moment occurred. At the same time, he's reading newspaper articles that were written during the war, and realizing that the ways in which that they are falsifying the information to make it seem like Italy is doing really well, and they're winning, and they're the best, and nobody can stop them. Reading about the war in North Africa, where when the Italians have to retreat, it's not mentioned. But when they do sort of win a battle, it doesn't mention the fact that they've won this battle, like 100 miles back from where they were last week. It'll just say, woo, we won, that's awesome. Not telling the whole story. And as he reads on, he gets to the later parts of the war. And a lot of these accounts actually remind me a lot of Japanese authors from a similar era, like Kenzaburo Oe writes about this, I think, in several stories and in other places, about the end of the war in Japan, and the moment when Emperor Hirohito came on the radio and announced, I'm just a regular guy, I'm not a god, we're, surrendering this war, sorry guys, whatever. And this feeling of betrayal that Oe felt, not only from the government, but all the adults in his life who have been telling him the empire is a god, that our country can do all these things, that we're winning this war, that we're the best. And then it turns out, things weren't going the way they said. And then the Americans show up, and they're not, ogres or whatever. They're just a bunch of guys giving out treats. And so Umberto Eco experienced a similar phenomenon a few years earlier when the Americans and the British, well, the Allies, came into southern Italy. And he sort of realizes this propaganda about them is not all true, necessarily. And a lot of this comes back to that main theme with eco that we were talking about earlier in terms of lies and forgery, and specifically in this book about sort of the problem or the inadequacy of written documents or sort of material research, documentary research, to explain a human life or even the world in general. Later on in the book, the main character begins to actually remember some of these events that he is only reading about. And I mentioned that confusion he felt about, at what moment did he go from believing in Il Duce to not? And through his memories, he realizes that the process was much more gradual and invisible. And that obviously when he was at school, he had to write these essays about Il Duce, and his parents even encouraged him, saying, just tell them what they want to hear, because we want you to get good grades and go to a good school and be successful. And the way to do that in that particular moment of time was to praise Mussolini and praise the fascist government. But he sort of realizes that he had been living a double life this whole time, that what he was writing and what he was feeling and what he his actual experiences were quite a bit different. There was a huge disconnect there. And that even though the country as a whole, the country of Italy, you could say materially or whatever politically was under a fascist government, he remembers that there's these underground groups, these partisans living in the hills near his village, who had their own influence. And the fact that if you just read the documentary materials, it seems almost like they just appear out of nowhere at the end of the war, or when the Allies come in. Suddenly there's all these partisan groups and these communists and whatever. It's like, where the hell did they come from? Well, they were around this whole time. They just weren't being written about. They weren't in the newspapers, and people were keeping it underground. It was all oral and things like this. And so a main theme of this novel is the sort of fallibility of relying on these written documents, whether they're true or false or whatever. Even the truest of documents, that is, documenting only entirely accurate information, fails to tell the whole story. And so it's quite an interesting novel in that sense, especially for someone who's so interested in the written language that he writes novels. And obviously as a scholar, he does all this research using written documents. He understands that there's a limit to what he can learn using these things. And probably that's an element of semiotics, of the limits of written language and written communication, or even oral communication, and these use of signs and symbols that have meanings beyond their words. The mysterious flame of Queen Loana has a meaning beyond what is literally referred to in the comic book about the mysterious flame. Like this phrase has its own power, just as a series of sounds almost, or a sort of evocative feeling. So as is generally the case with Umberto Eco's novels, you sort of start off with an initial premise, and you think the book is sort of going one way, and then it turns out he just wants to talk about some weird semiotics thing that he's thinking about. And I feel like Prague Cemetery has a similar feeling. My memory of Foucault's Pendulum is not entirely clear, but I remember having a similar feeling of thinking the book was taking me on an adventure, and then about midway through it stops and is actually about something completely different. And this book definitely is not a thrilling book, and you get into it thinking it might be a bit of a comedy, when really it's not much of a comedy, and you'd think it might be a series of misadventures of this crazy guy who only remembers books, but it's really more this exploration of his childhood, and not much goes on other than him exploring his childhood. But I do think I've never heard anyone talk about this book. I hear people talk about other Umberto Eco novels, mostly The Name of the Rose, which I haven't actually read. But this book seems to have flown under the radar. People are not as interested in it. And it's a bit more of a niche subject matter in terms of you kind of want to be interested in fascist Italy a little bit to get anything out of this book. But it's quite an interesting read. And and I thought, why the heck not tell you all about it? Because no one else is going to do it. So I may as well. So this has been the return of Malkwell's books. I have been and remain being Balkwell. And we actually have a special guest. Oh, who's this? This is a special guest who I must introduce because she loves books so much. Her love for books is so all-encompassing that she climbs up on the shelves and pulls them all onto the floor for later perusal. So this has been Balkwell's books, The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana by Umberto Eco. Perhaps I shall return again in the near future. It's a new year, 2025. Who knows what is going to happen? Goodbye.